Hello, this is video lecture number 75. Today we are looking at From Boom to Bust. Our subsections today are Business After the War, Consumer Culture, and the Coming of the Great Depression. Now this is a very important time in our history, and this section covers the lead up to the Depression. So we're just going to jump right in again because there's a lot to cover. With that very first subsection, Business After the War. So by the 1920s, large-scale corporations headed by chief executive officers, CEOs, had replaced individual or family-run enterprises as the major form of American business organization. Through successive waves of consolidation, the 200 largest businesses came to control almost half the country's non-banking corporate wealth by 1929. The greatest number of mergers occurred in rising industries such as chemicals, in which DuPont emerged as the leader, and electrical appliances, General Electric, or GE. Rarely did any single corporation monopolize an entire field. Rather, an oligopoly of a few major producers tended to dominate each market. At the same time, mergers between Wall Street banks enhanced the role of New York as the financial center of the United States and, increasingly, the world. U.S. companies exercised growing international power. Immediately after World War I, the United States experienced a series of economic shocks. They began with rampant inflation, as prices jumped by 1/3 in 1919 alone. Then came a sharp 2-year recession in which unemployment rose to 10%. Finally, the economy began to grow smoothly and more Americans began to benefit from the success of corporate enterprise. Between 1922 and 29, the gross domestic product grew from $74.1 billion to $103.1 billion. Per capita income rose impressively from $641 to $847, about $11,000 today, a third of the present per capita income. Consumer products, particularly the automobile, sparked this expansion. Now, not only did the products themselves create growth, but producing cars and refrigerators also required huge quantities of steel, chemicals, and oil. Despite the boom, the economy had significant weaknesses throughout the 1920s. Agriculture, which still employed 1/4 of all workers, never fully recovered from the post-war recession. Once Europe's economy revived, its farmers flooded world markets with grain and other farm products, causing prices to fall. Other industries, including coal and textiles, languished for similar reasons. Many rural Americans shared little of the decade's prosperity. The bottom 40% of American families had an average annual income of only $725, which equates to about $9,000 today. All right, our next subsection is consumer culture. By 1929, 40% of American households owned a radio. At the same time, electric refrigerators and vacuum cleaners came into use in affluent homes. As early as 1922, 10 magazines claimed circulations of over 2.5 million, including Time, the Saturday Evening Post, and Good Housekeeping. If one judged from the advertisements in the magazines of the 1920s, all Americans wore fashionable clothes and drove the latest model cars. That, of course, was not true. But the advertising industry reached new levels of ambition and sophistication, entering what one historian calls the era of the aggressive hard sell. In practice, the question of who participated in consumer culture was contested, as shown vividly in the Tulsa race riot, when white mobs plundered furniture and phonograph players from black homes. Surrounded by exhortations to indulge in luxuries, millions of working-class Americans barely squeaked by, with wives and mothers often taking paid work to provide basic necessities. At times of crisis, Some families sold all their furniture, starting with pianos and phonograph players and moving, if necessary, to dining tables and beds. When every dollar counted, the lure of consumer culture often created friction. Married women resented husbands who spent discretionary cash and expected wives to make do. Generational conflicts emerged, especially when wage-earning children challenged the long-standing expectation that their earnings should go all to mother. Poor and affluent families often had one thing in common. They stretched their incomes by taking advantage of new forms of borrowing, such as auto loans and installment plans. Buy now, pay later, said the ads, and millions did, a factor that contributed to the country's broad economic overextension in the 1920s. Anyone, no matter how rich, could get into debt. But consumer credit was particularly perilous for those living already on economic margins. Such easy credit turned out to be a contributing factor to the bust in 1929. Now, no profession typified national consumer culture better than the automobile industry, a showpiece of modern consumer capitalism that revolutionized American economic and social life. Mass production of cars played a major role in the boom of the 1920s. In a single year, in 1929, Americans spent $2.58 billion on automobiles. By the end of the decade, they owned 23 million cars, about 80% of the world's automobiles, or an average of one car for every 6 people. The exuberant expansion of the auto industry rippled through the economy, with both positive and negative results. It stimulated the steel, petroleum, chemical, rubber, and glass industries, and directly or indirectly provided jobs for 3.7 million workers. Highway construction became a $1 billion a year enterprise, financed by federal subsidies and state gas taxes. Car ownership spurred the growth of the suburbs, and in 1924, the first suburban shopping center, Country Club Plaza outside Kansas City, Missouri, emerged. But cars were expensive, and most Americans bought them on credit. This created risks, not only for buyers, but for the whole economy. Borrowers who could not pay off car loans lost their entire investment in their cars. If they defaulted on their loan, banks were left holding unpaid loans. But amid the boom of the 1920s, such a scenario seemed remote. Cars changed the way Americans spent their leisure time. Though gasoline was not cheap, proud drivers took their machines on the road. An infrastructure of gas stations, motels, and drive-in restaurants soon catered to drivers. Cars also changed the dating patterns of young Americans. A Model T Ford offered more privacy than did the living room or the front porch, and contributed to increased sexual experimentation among the young. Though early cars were hardly comfortable places, manufacturers learned to accommodate the market. Railroad travel began to fade then, as automobiles became central to tourism. The American Automobile Association, founded in 1902, estimated that in 1929 almost a third of the population took vacations by car, patronizing auto camps, as they were called, and cabins. Already by 1923 there were 247 auto camps in Colorado alone. In rural areas, cars contributed to the consolidation of churches and schools, which could now be reached over longer distances. The automobile also stimulated inter-community leagues for softball and other activities, as well as an insatiable interest in movies and other commercial pleasures. Rural Southern blacks, if they could get use of a car, found they could travel 3 counties away and secure a loan that white bankers in their own county might be reluctant to offer. Movies, which had their root in short silent films shown in turn-of-the-century Nickelodeons, formed a second centerpiece of consumer culture. By 1910, the movie-making industry had moved to Southern California to take advantage of cheap land, sunshine, and varied scenery within easy reach. The large studios, United Artists, Paramount, and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, were run mainly by Eastern European Jewish immigrants. By the end of World War I, Hollywood reigned as the movie capital of the world, producing nearly 90% of all films. New feature-length movies, exhibited in large, ornate theaters, attracted middle-class as well as working-class audiences. Flappers represented only a tiny minority of women, but thanks to the movies and advertising, they became an influential symbol of women's sexual and social emancipation. In cities, young immigrant women eagerly bought American makeup and the latest flapper fashions and went dancing to jazz music. Jazz stars helped popularize the style among working-class African Americans. Mexican-American teenagers joined the trend, though they usually found themselves under the watchful eyes of La Dueña, or the chaperone. American radio and film had an immediate global impact, and politicians quickly grasped the potential benefits for the United States. In 1919, with government support, General Electric spearheaded the creation of Radio Corporation of America, or RCA, to expand U.S. presence in foreign radio markets. During the 1920s, RCA, which had a federal appointee on its board of directors, emerged as a major provider of radio transmission in Latin America and East Asia. Meanwhile, by 1925, American films made up 95% of the movies that were screened in Britain, 80% of the movies that were seen in Latin America, and 70% of the movies in France. When Britain and Germany instituted quotas, requiring that the number of imported films not exceed the number of domestic ones, Hollywood studios set up European subsidiaries to churn out hundreds of what they called quota quickies, allowing the flow of imports to continue unchecked. The United States was experimenting with what historians call soft power, the exercise of political cultural influence, as radio and movies exuberantly celebrated the American dream. Okay, time for our last subsection then, the coming of the Great Depression. Toward the end of the decade, strains on the economy began to show. By 1927, consumer lending had become the 10th largest business in the country, topping $7 billion a year. Increasing numbers of Americans also bought into the stock market, often with unrealistic expectations. Corporate profits were so high that some companies fully invested in their own operations plowed excess earnings back into the stock market. Some market players compounded risk by purchasing on margin. Such a strategy raked in gains as long as the economy grew, as long as jobs were plentiful and investments rose in value. But those conditions did not last. Yet, even when the stock market crashed in a series of plunges between October 25th and November 13th of 1929, few onlookers understood the magnitude of the crisis. Deep, cyclical depressions had been a familiar part of the industrializing economy, at least since the panics of the 1830s. Such depressions had tended to follow periods of rapid growth and speculation. A sharp downturn had occurred recently in 1921 without triggering long-term disaster. The market rose again in late 1929 and early 1930, and while a great deal of money had been lost, most Americans hoped the aftermath of the crash would be brief. Over the next 4 years, industrial production fell 37%, and construction plunged by 78%. Prices for crops and other raw materials, already so low, fell by half. By 1932, unemployment reached 24%. The nation was experiencing the start of the Great Depression. A precipitous drop, then, in consumer spending helped deepen the crisis. Having bought on credit and now facing hard times, consumers cut back dramatically, creating a vicious cycle of falling demand and forfeited loans. In late 1930s, several major banks went under, victims of overextended credit and reckless management. As industrial production slowed, a much larger wave of bank failures occurred in 1931. These bank failures caused an even more severe shock. Since the government did not insure bank deposits, savings in failed banks simply vanished. The Great Depression was, in part, a global crisis that emerged from the aftermath of World War I. By shattering Europe politically and economically, the war had destabilized international systems of trade and finance. Britain's central bank had long played a key role in managing the international finance system. The heavy cost of the war, though, prevented it from resuming that role. In addition, the war disrupted the international gold standard. The United States and most European nations had long tied the value of their currencies to gold. The system had worked fairly well before the crisis of World War I, but it was vulnerable during economic downturns when foreign financiers withdrew their investments and demanded gold payments. Now, faced with economic catastrophe, both Britain and Germany abandoned the gold standard in 1931. When they did so, their economies began a modest recovery. A similar pattern held for other industrialized and developing countries. But the Hoover administration argued that such a move would cause irreparable damage to trade and also to the value of the dollar. Thus, the Federal Reserve, which many Americans hoped would mitigate the crisis, was forced to do two contradictory things at once: try to revive the economy and protect the nation's gold supply. The United States finally left the gold standard in 1933 under Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration. This and Roosevelt's resuscitation of banks stimulated a partial recovery between 1933 and 1937. But by that time, the crisis had achieved catastrophic dimensions. Billions had been lost in bank and business failures, and the economy had completely stalled. Partial recovery brought unemployment down from 25% to a mere 14%. In an effort to ease the Depression, President Hoover did take modest action. He created a Reconstruction Finance Corporation to provide loans to banks, to railroads, and utilities. His administration also slashed taxes, and Hoover extorted state and local governments to employ the jobless on public projects. Overall, though, Republicans clung to the belief that depressions were healthy and self-regulating. Adhering to their long-standing faith in high protective tariffs, Republicans also enacted the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930, hoping to stimulate domestic manufacturing. Now, historians are divided on whether the tariff worsened the Depression or not, but it certainly did not help. It triggered retaliatory tariffs in other countries, as governments across the world struggled to protect their own industries. Thus, while the Great Depression began mere months after Hoover took office, the conditions that worsened it unfolded gradually over his presidential term. By the early 1930s, then, comprehending the magnitude of the crisis, Americans looked back wistfully on the previous decade of prosperity. In the 1920s, business had boomed, and politics had been so placid that people chuckled when President Coolidge disappeared on extended fishing trips. In the following decade, though, Americans still flocked to the movies when they could afford it, and they were eager to see light-hearted comedies that would help them forget everything that troubled them. But they now wanted bold action in Washington. In 1932, voters would replace Herbert Hoover with Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt. Republicans who had held solid majorities in both houses of Congress as late as 1931 found themselves swept out of power. Faced with the cataclysm of the Great Depression then, Americans transformed their government and created a modern welfare state. Okay, so that concludes today's video lecture. go ahead and answer your review questions at the bottom of the screen and continue on with your notes and your reading.